Thank you for that introduction. And for anyone who's noticed that I have changed outfits, it's not that I think that this is a wedding. It's just that I actually just got so cold. I thought I could be up here giving you this speech and actually chattering. So I've gone back to my Melbourne clothes. I thought it was warm here in Sydney. Okay, so my talk is called Courage is Contagious. Well, my remarks is called Courage is Contagious, and it is very much about democracy. But of course, let's just start with the fact that graduation is about all of you and your wonderful commitment to expanding and refining your capacities as the ethical leaders our wonderful country so desperately, desperately needs right now, and of course deserves. The effort we have come together to honor tonight. We are here very much to honor all of you and all the hard work you've put in. As you can probably hear from my accent, I'm an American by birth, which may help to explain the theme that I want to put forward for your consideration tonight, as you set forth to apply the wisdom and the courage you've developed in your time with us to make your lives, the organizations you lead, and the local and Australian community of which you are a part a better and more ethical place. That theme is the health of our democracy. In particular, why we can't take democracy for granted. The special role that you as VFF graduates have in preserving and protecting Australian democracy, and finally, why you don't have to do this work alone, but can and should call on your fellow graduates and indeed the entire alumni network of Cranlana to help you recognize the danger signs that I think our democracy is currently experiencing, call the attention of others to those danger signs, and help return our system to good health. It's hard not to start any discussion of democracy by quoting Churchill's observations that democracy is the worst form of government except all the others that have been tried. But for Australians, what I think makes democracy particularly precious is the way it treasures, through words, but also and more importantly through action, the value that arguably as a nation we prize above all others. And that value is equality. Voting in free and fair elections and being ruled by law and not the capricious wishes of the person who happens to be in charge demonstrate our commitment to the audacious and, from a historical perspective, the relatively recent claim that the voice and preference of every single citizen about how she or he wants to be governed literally counts. All well and good. But the question is, why do I want to bring a focus to the majesty and miracle of democracy right now, when our own system of parliamentary governance is actually doing quite well? Aren't we, as we have been since 2006, a full democracy according to indexes like those produced by Freedom House and the Economist's Intelligence Unit? Don't we have good ratings for all the components of a thriving democracy that is both stable and strong, including our electoral processes and pluralism, the functioning of our government, our political participation, political culture, and civil liberties? Well, yes, we do. It's true. We have a lot to be grateful for here in Australia. But having been an avid observer of the slow and painful backsliding of the democracy in the land of my birth, a democracy that for the first time was downgraded last year from a full democracy to a partial or fragile democracy, I can see some of the same early warning signs here that first began popping up decades ago in the United States and have led to the still fragile state of play there now. While most of us only tuned into America's democratic troubles when Trump came on the scene, the truth is that the change to political culture and elevation of demagogues began ramping up decades ago, when people like me began warning about them, but we went unheard. So what kind of warning signs am I seeing? The first is an increase in disinformation and violent hate speech. Did you know that during the federal election this year in May, the AEC, the Australian Electoral Commission, documented at least 32 prominent disinformation campaigns that spread virally through social and at times also mainstream media? These disinformation campaigns included false claims that the AEC was tied to the Liberal Party or the AEC was tied to the Labour Party, that normal counting practice was evidence that the AEC had, quote, rigged the vote, that dead Australians voted, that swathes, and that's a quote, of Indigenous people were being wiped from the rolls without notice, and that Dominion and our skittle machines were rigged to favour one side. Candidates from one well-funded far-right party also claimed, both before and after the election took place, and without a single shred of evidence, that the poll had been rigged. This followed the infiltration during the pandemic of well-organized racists and anti-Semites into the anti-vaccination movement that grew throughout the pandemic. Some of you may remember the gallows that were constructed last year for the Victorian Premier during an anti-vaccination, anti-lockdown event that was strung with a cross that had the word treason written on it. Sometimes it's hard to take some of this stuff seriously. For instance, the claim that Dominion and SkyToll machines rigged our federal election for Labour or the Libs. It's obviously directly imported from the United States because here in Australia, not only do we not use Dominion or SkyToll machines to count the vote, we don't even use vote counting machines at all. But sadly, the silliness and or irrelevance of disinformation does not stop it spreading, nor does it stop it having the corrosive effect it has on the trust that's necessary for democracy to function. It destroys one of those things you don't even know you have until it's gone, a thing called consensus reality, which is our ability to know what is true and what is real through the confirmation of those around us. Without consensus reality, there is no shared view of the nature of the society we are living in and the issues that matter and that need to be resolved. This, as you can imagine, stops the peaceful collective problem solving required for democracy to function dead in its tracks. And while the destruction of American consensus reality is way further down the track than our own, we are in the running. In large part, this is because News Corp is a big and critical part of our media ecosystem too. And just this year, a healthy majority of Australians told the Edelman Trust Barometer that they believed journalists, government leaders, and business leaders were, quote, actively trying to mislead them by saying things they know are false or grossly exaggerated. So that's one worrying sign. 2, I'm also seeing things that I saw in the United States in regard to political party gatekeeping or the failure of political party gatekeeping around right-wing extremism. Australian leaders would be wise to keep their eye on the gatekeeping role political parties must perform to keep our democracy healthy. By gatekeeping, I mean ensuring that only suitable candidates, those who support democratic forms of governance and have the skills and experience to do the job, are put forward for office. This is what the Republicans failed to do when it came to Donald Trump, with disastrous results. And we're starting to see similar types of failures here. For instance, the decision of the Victorian Liberals at last month's state election to preference an out and proud neo-Nazi candidate before Labour, rather than, as the Labour Party did, putting the anti-Semite last. The state Liberal Party's loss, which followed the party's loss federally in May, means that centre-right parties in Australia have some important decisions to make that closely parallel those that faced Republicans in 2012. Then, in the wake of Obama's victory, the Republican committee determined that they needed to broaden their base to appeal to a more diverse swathe of Americans than the white, rural, and often male voters that were their traditional constituency. And the subtext of that was that if you broadened the base, you would start to undermine some of the racism and anti-Semitism that was running in the party and that had become so endemic. But the Republican committee, as we saw, lost. And instead of diversifying, Republicans ended up doubling down on the racist, violent, and conspiracy-laden values of the party's extreme right wing, which led to the 2016 victory and likely renomination for president in 2024 of Donald Trump, who just last week sat down for Thanksgiving dinner with the out and proud anti-Semitic musical artist formerly known as Kanye West and high-profile white nationalist Nick Fuentes. It would be a shame, to put it mildly, for the Liberals and Nationals, whether they remain in coalition or go it alone, to make a similar choice as they grapple with their electoral viability going forward, especially as right-wing extremism in this country is already on the rise. In the last 2 years, nationalist and racist violent extremism has increased 750%, with half the AFP's caseload now taken up with it. And for the first time this year, the AFP had to stand up a unit to protect federal politicians and candidates in the lead up to the May poll. What's the third sign? So here's the third sign that I worry about here in this country. The last risk to democracy that Australia shares with the United States and that I see as a warning sign is growing levels of wealth inequality. Wealth is what a family owns minus what they owe. In the United States, the top 10% own 76% of the nation's wealth, while the bottom 50% own just, and I'll let you have a guess, own just what percent? 1. So the top 10% own 76% of the nation's wealth, and the bottom 50% own 1%. That is really staggering wealth inequality. So luckily, things are not that bad here, not by a long shot. But nonetheless, Australia has not been immune to rising inequities in wealth that French economist Thomas Piketty has been documenting happening across the globe since the 1980s. These kinds of inequities, resulting from what Piketty argues is the failure of center-left parties when they get into office to fairly redistribute what center-right parties do such a good job of accumulating when they're in charge. The resulting economic disenfranchisement of the majority leads them to the understandable conclusion that democracy has nothing to offer them. In Australia, our wealth inequality is found most acutely in housing, where the generation gap in home ownership has been expanding since 2003. Did you know that despite being the most educationally qualified generation ever, the current crop of 25 to 39-year-old Australian millennials are 3 times less likely than their parents' generation was at the same age to own their home? One wonders if this explains why 51% of this age group, the 25 to 39-year-old age group, which is the most of any of the age groups surveyed, told the World Values Survey in 2018 that they thought it would be good, or very good, for Australia to have a, quote, strong leader who does not have to bother with Parliament and elections. Scary, huh? So what can you do? Democracy's defining characteristic is the capacity to self-correct. But while this offers hope, it also means work. The work of paying attention to the signs of decay, disillusionment, and backsliding, and not thinking someone else will do something about them, because that someone is you. I have identified a few elements of our democracy that need close attention, innovation, and/or repair. The problem of disinformation and the rapid decline of the consensus reality required for the peaceful collective problem solving that defines the democratic way, that's one. The requirement that parties to the right of center keep extremists out or in line while finding ways to remain electorally viable, that's 2. And the imperative to minimize the wealth inequalities that are always found wherever democracy is on a downhill slide, that's 3. These threats demand urgent attention, but for this to happen, we need to consider the current understanding we have of democracy itself. Rather than something politicians are responsible for doing badly or doing well over there, and that we only participate in once every 3 years, we need to consider the role that every citizen has in nurturing, protecting, and maintaining a system that we have had the luxury of taking for granted in Australia. But, as the US example shows, is terribly, horribly fragile. So brittle, in fact, that once pushed to the edge, as has happened in America, it may not be possible to turn it back. That's a verdict for the future to deliver, but I would not be surprised if America remains a partial democracy for many, many years to come, if not worse. This was arguably Sir Vincent Fairfax's vision, as we can see with the quote, of a community of leaders working hard within their local communities with a shared vision for the common good of Australian society, with that both that the process and shared vision being democracy itself. Which returns us to the question about your role in all of this. Adapting the example of the wonderful Tim Snyder, the author of the must-read book On Tyranny, what I would urge you to do is pick something, one thing, that you are uniquely positioned to do and focus your energy on that. Perhaps you are a media player who can contribute to the diversification of the Australian media scene, or someone with viable ideas about how to return sustainable levels of consensus reality through media regulation. Maybe you are a member or supporter of right-of-centre parties in Australia, or could become one, and influence the way they interpret and respond to their own electoral postmortems and those produced by reputable sources like the ANU, a process that is in train right now and will point the party in one direction or the other in the weeks and months to come. And it is critical that we have multiple parties that are viable contenders for government. Democracy doesn't work without it. Perhaps you can use your power in the military, health, government, or civil organizations you lead to work on the problem of housing and wealth inequality. Not just because the direct harm housing instability and poverty wreaks on our fellow Australians and the way it offends the most basic notions of distributive justice, but also because of the destabilizing impact it has on our democratic form of government. There is also work you can do in your own lives, communities, and workplaces. Work that doesn't just articulate the values of equality, pluralism, the rule of law, and collaborative and peaceful problem solving, which is important, don't get me wrong. It's important to talk about this stuff and talk about it a lot, just like I'm doing here tonight. But, and just as importantly, we need in our own lives, in our own communities, in our own workplaces to model these values. Because as we know, younger generations who remain undecided or even antagonistic about the value of democracy will be far more persuaded by what we do than what we say. Can we run our hospitals, educational institutions, government departments, corporations, social businesses, law firms, museums, and galleries more democratically? Before you think, oh God, Leslie, that will never work. Let me offer you an example from my own life of how the outside-of-the-box thinking and hard work of adults, when I was a child, had a profound and lasting influence on my understanding and respect for democracy. The example is of my high school back in the United States. Despite being part of one of the oldest and most hierarchically run institutions in Western society, the public school system, the teachers, parents, and students in my area came together to create an offshoot of the mainstream high school. It was called the Alternative School. The Alternative School was founded on Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development and the principles of direct democracy. Every week, the entire faculty and student body met to discuss and vote on the laws and rules that governed us, with everyone, the students and the far smaller group of teachers, having one vote. Seniors shared the work of chairing these meetings with the teachers and had to acquit themselves well in running several in order to graduate. Much like me, many students of the school have gone on to make a passion for ethics and democratic rights and principles a core part of their personal and professional lives. What you do with kids really matters. It's amazing. And if they can do it, why can't we? But however you decide to make your ethical mark, the most important thing for you to remember is that you are not alone. Because while we are gathered here to mark the end of your time with VFF, we are also celebrating a beginning. The start of your journey as an alumnus of Cranlana, an association that we treat with the utmost seriousness, and we hope you will too. Because right here in this room today are a slew of people who you can rely on for the next stage in your journey. People who know and respect who you are, what you value, and all that you're capable of being for yourself and doing for the world, and who are dedicated to nurturing the wisdom you have found in your year with us, and to infecting and reinfecting you with the contagion of courage as you start on your way. Thank you.